I grew up in a tight-knit religious community in the Midwest, the kind where everyone knows each other's business and devout obedience is the bedrock of faith. My parents were pillars of this congregation. My father led prayer sessions, and my mother taught Sunday school. From an early age, I was taught that questioning their authority was sinful, so I never did. I followed every rule, wore every modest dress, and recited every verse with careful devotion. My father hammered into my head that my duty was to become a good wife and mother, as though I existed solely for that purpose. His eyes brimmed with disapproval any time I displayed a trace of individuality. Over time, I felt my own identity slipping, replaced by someone who lived in constant fear of making a misstep. The older I got, the heavier that burden became, until I almost couldn't breathe. I was taught that my parents' word was final, and no deviation would be tolerated. When I was 16, my father threatened to break off my friendship with a neighbor's daughter simply because I asked about applying to a local community college. He told me I needed to focus on my real purpose, become a wife. The older I got, the more intense his demands became. By 19, they were pushing me to court a family friend, a man almost twice my age. They called it a blessed union, but I saw it as a prison sentence. He was the kind of man who rarely looked me in the eye, always spoke over me, and never seemed interested in anything beyond ensuring I'd be a compliant spouse. My mother supported all of it, convinced this was the best way to safeguard my soul. I felt trapped and hopeless. Around that time, I discovered a hidden stash of old textbooks in the attic. My mother's younger sister had left them behind years ago when she distanced herself from the family. Though we rarely spoke about my aunt, I'd overheard bits and pieces. She was the black sheep. She got into arguments with my father about everything from theology to women's rights, and eventually she packed up and left. Those textbooks were my first glimpse of a world outside my parents' narrow teachings. I devoured chapters on biology, world history, and literature in secret. By the time I turned 20, I knew I couldn't remain under my parents' roof for long. My aunt's example haunted me. If she could escape, maybe I could too. But I had no money and no idea how to start. My parents controlled every aspect of my life, from finances to social contact. I started babysitting for families within our community, hoping to earn a little cash. My father insisted I hand over the payments for household expenses, so I pretended to comply, slipping a few bills aside before giving the rest. It took months, but eventually I saved a modest sum. I was terrified of being caught. One night, I overheard my parents talking about finalizing the engagement with that family friend. My heart pounded as they said I'd be a bride by the following spring. Panic set in. I knew time was running out. Through an ancient computer in the church's youth room, I researched every place I could go where my parents might not find me. My mother had once mentioned missionaries in Kenya, so my search led me to a volunteer program in Nairobi. I applied, telling them I was desperate for a fresh start. They responded weeks later with an acceptance email. I almost fainted seeing those words on the screen. There was a small stipend and housing in a shared dorm, but I needed a plane ticket and enough money to cover living costs until my first payment. My stash wasn't enough, so I sold a gold necklace my grandmother had given me. It broke my heart to part with it, but I had no choice. Then I forged my father's signature on the passport application. I practiced it for days, terrified I'd get it wrong. When my passport arrived in the mail, I intercepted it before my parents could. Every step felt like a gamble. If they discovered my plans, I knew they'd lock me in the house until the wedding. Sometimes I wondered if leaving would be worth the risk, but my fear of staying was stronger. I finally slipped out one early morning when my parents believed I was heading to a church event. I had a small suitcase, my savings, and my passport tucked inside my coat. Getting on that plane still feels like a dream. My stomach churned the entire flight, and my nerves only intensified when I arrived in Nairobi. The volunteer group had arranged for a driver to pick me up, and he was a friendly Kenyan man with a warm smile who introduced himself as Peter. I'd never experienced such open kindness from a stranger. He helped me get situated in the shared dorm, which was a simple but welcoming place with a handful of other volunteers from different countries. I was homesick at first, but I also felt liberated in a way I'd never known before. Nobody was hovering over me, dictating my every move. The work itself involved assisting with educational programs for children in underprivileged areas. I found myself reading with groups of kids who barely had enough textbooks, and I helped organize art activities. The staff, including several locals, were patient with me as I adjusted to life in a new country. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I reminded myself that anything was better than becoming that man's subservient wife back home. Slowly, I built friendships with the other volunteers, especially a woman named Yasmin from France and a British man named Daniel. We bonded over evening meals, sharing stories about our lives. They found my background shocking. Yasmin insisted I was brave for running away, while Daniel said I was proof that even the most rigid situations had escape routes. Their support mattered to me because part of me felt shame, as if I'd betrayed my family's expectations. One evening, after a particularly rewarding day with the kids, I checked my phone and discovered a barrage of missed calls from an unknown number. My stomach dropped. Then I saw the voicemails. It was my father, sounding furious and almost hysterical. He demanded I return immediately, accusing me of disgracing the family and reneging on my God-given role. He threatened to contact the authorities, though I doubted he had any actual legal grounds to force me back. Still, the fear crept in. In his messages, he insisted I would be condemned to eternal punishment if I didn't come home. My mother left a tearful message, begging me to think of their reputation. That night, I barely slept, torn between guilt and a fierce determination never to return. I saved every voicemail, every text. I wasn't sure why, but some part of me sensed I might need them. 2 months passed, and I started to find my rhythm. I explored parts of the city with Yasmin and Daniel, learned basic Swahili phrases, and felt a sense of autonomy I'd never known. Then came the day my father's threats took a new turn. He claimed he knew secrets about my lineage that would devastate me if revealed. I assumed it was just another manipulation tactic, an attempt to lure me back by fear. But something in his tone made me wonder if he was serious. The next time he called, I answered, determined to stand my ground. He told me I'd been living a lie, that I was never his daughter biologically. He said my mother had sinned with another man and he'd raised me only out of duty. Hearing that left me rattled. I wanted to scream at him for lying, but he sounded convinced. After that call, I confronted my mother via text, demanding the truth. She initially denied everything, but a week later, she sent me a long, tearful email. She admitted I'd been conceived during a brief relationship with a foreign missionary who visited our church. My father found out when I was just a toddler. For years, they covered it up to keep appearances within the community. She also dropped another bombshell. The missionary was Kenyan, which she assumed was the reason I'd run to Africa, as if something drew me there subconsciously. I felt numb reading those words. It was surreal. Learning my real father might be walking around somewhere in the same country I'd escaped to. Part of me wanted to search for him, to see if he even knew about me. Another part felt furious at the lies. My father's hypocrisy was unimaginable. In the days that followed, I was paralyzed with conflicting emotions. Yasmin and Daniel urged me to seek counseling. With their help, I connected to a local therapist who specialized in cross-cultural issues. Unpacking the realization that the man I'd called Dad all my life wasn't actually related to me was both shocking and, in some strange way, freeing. It explained why he treated me so harshly compared to my younger brothers. It also confirmed that his insistence on marrying me off was less about love or faith and more about getting rid of a constant reminder of my mother's sin. That realization ignited a new resolve in me. I decided I wasn't done fighting. He wanted me to stay quiet, to slip back and let him maintain his facade. But I'd learned from the voicemails and threats that he feared public embarrassment above all. I reached out to an old friend who'd left our congregation a few years earlier. She still lived in the same town and had connections with community members who were unhappy with my father's authoritarian rule. With her guidance, I drafted an anonymous letter detailing the abuse, the forced courtship, and the truth about my paternity. I included snippets of his voicemails, carefully transcribed, where he threatened me. My friend circulated these letters among several families in the church, slipping them into mailboxes under the cover of night. It was a bold move, but I wanted to expose him for the hypocrite he was. My father had used the pulpit to shame other congregants for lesser sins, all while concealing the fact that he'd built his entire family on a lie. The fallout was immediate. Rumors spread like wildfire, and the church started asking questions. My father's reputation took a hit, but he doubled down, calling me a tool of the devil. He gave a sermon in which he described me as an ungrateful daughter corrupted by worldly influences. He denied everything, labeling the letters as forgeries. That's when I decided to release audio clips of his voicemails. My friend posted them online, tagging various community members and even a few local journalists. In those recordings, his rage was on full display, complete with biblical curses and threats to have me brought back in chains. Once the audio leaked, some of his staunchest supporters started to waver. People realized he was capable of cruelty behind closed doors. Church elders confronted him. Some demanded he step down from leadership. Others tried to defend him, but the damage was undeniable. My mother's silence added fuel to the fire, making people suspect the worst. Back in Nairobi, I received countless messages from church acquaintances, some offering support, others spewing the same old judgmental rhetoric. I felt a surge of empowerment. Everything he'd tried to bury was finally coming to light. Meanwhile, I focused on my volunteer work and tried to find any lead on my biological father. My mother offered scant details, claiming she didn't know much beyond his first name and the fact that he'd volunteered with an international organization decades ago. It felt like a long shot, but I approached a few local mission groups, hoping someone might remember a Kenyan who served in the US around the time I was conceived. Most had no records that far back, yet I refused to give up. If he was still alive, I believed I had the right to at least meet him once. That desire fueled me forward. My revenge against my father wasn't complete. A few months after the letters and audio clips went public, I learned he was still preaching, though attendance had dropped. He was also pressuring my mother to disown me entirely. I decided to strike again, this time with a more personal blow. I knew from experience that our congregation valued financial integrity almost as much as religious piety. With help from my friend, I got hold of a partial financial report from the church. We highlighted suspicious expenses that hinted at misuse of funds. My father had been channeling donations into his personal bank account. We compiled the evidence and sent it to the church's board and a local newspaper. The scandal that followed dwarfed the earlier drama. Accusations flew, and some members threatened legal action. My father's world of moral superiority began crumbling even more. Meanwhile, I kept searching for my biological father. As luck would have it, a local pastor named Samuel heard about my story through the volunteer network. He remembered an older Kenyan gentleman who'd gone to the US for a mission trip about 24 years ago. Samuel helped me track down a retired teacher named Lucas. The moment I met Lucas, I felt an odd sense of calm. He had kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. We talked for hours. He admitted he'd once volunteered in the Midwest, but he swore he knew nothing about a child. He'd had a brief relationship with a woman there, but it ended before he returned to Kenya. We decided to do a DNA test, though I tried not to get my hopes up. Weeks later, the results confirmed he was my father. Both of us just sat there, stunned. He cried quietly, apologizing for never knowing I existed. He told me he'd have made different choices if he'd known. I believed him. Lucas wasn't some saint, but he seemed honest, a stark contrast to the man who'd raised me under intimidation and lies. He asked me endless questions about my life, and we bonded over little things like our shared interest in reading. Meeting him gave me a feeling of closure, yet it also opened a door to a world I'd never anticipated. He introduced me to some of his relatives, who welcomed me with open arms. They didn't judge me for my past. Instead, they marveled at how I'd managed to find my way here. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere without pretense or shame. It was everything my upbringing lacked. I felt both exhilarated and a little sad. Although I felt more at peace, I couldn't ignore what was happening back home. My father was under investigation for embezzlement of church funds, and certain authorities were looking into whether he'd coerced minors into arranged marriages. Some families stepped forward with disturbing stories of similar treatment. My mother tried to reach me multiple times, but I refused to answer her calls. She had enabled him for so many years, standing by in silence while he planned to marry me off. I remembered the humiliation, the threats, the suffocating fear. I realized I owed her nothing, not even a chance to explain her side. I'd given her opportunities before, and she never once stood up for me. I chose to remain distant, focusing on my new life. If that seemed heartless, so be it. I felt justified knowing what they'd all put me through. In time, the legal proceedings escalated. My father was removed from his role. My friend kept me updated on every development. The congregation was in turmoil, divided between loyalists and those who believed he had deceived them for years. Donations plummeted, lawsuits loomed. I felt a strange satisfaction knowing I'd played a part in dismantling his toxic kingdom. It wasn't a matter of pettiness. It was about ensuring he couldn't harm anyone else the way he'd harmed me. Back in Nairobi, I continued volunteering, rooming with Yasmin and Daniel, and forging a relationship with Lucas. He offered to help me pursue further education. I'd never dreamed of attending a proper university, yet here was an unexpected chance to reinvent myself entirely. My father had tried to push me into a corner to break my spirit. Instead, I found a future filled with possibilities I'd never imagined. I often think about the life I left behind. Sometimes I wonder if my mother regrets standing by him, or if my brothers resent me for upending everything. But I've come to realize that none of that truly matters. I have my own life to live now, and I won't waste another moment seeking their approval. I found a family in Lucas and his relatives, genuine friends in Yasmin and Daniel, and a sense of purpose I'd never thought possible. My father's downfall was his own doing. All I did was bring his secrets into the light. He wanted to marry me off, trap me in a cycle of submission and silence, but he failed. I have no pity for him, nor do I offer any forgiveness. He betrayed me from the start, and he deserved every ounce of justice that found him. Now, I'm saving up for university tuition and planning a future that doesn't hinge on anyone's permission. Part of me remains angry at all the years I lost, but I channel that anger into determination. If anyone reading this feels stuck in a life they didn't choose, I hope you find your path to freedom. Mine led me here, and I have no regrets. I am truly free, and that, more than anything, is the sweetest victory I could ever claim. I'm posting this under a throwaway account because I never want my family to find me. From my earliest memory, I sensed my mother hated the fact that I was born a girl. She never outright struck me, but she made sure I knew how inconvenient my existence was. Every time I showed her something from school, a drawing, a story I wrote, even a test I aced, she'd pick it apart and find the flaws. My father tried to smooth things over when he was still around, saying she was just under a lot of stress, but I noticed he never forced her to stop. He was always stuck in this limbo of hoping she'd change without actually confronting her. Then, when I was 10, he left. No warm goodbye, no custody battle. He left me a short note saying he was sorry, and then he disappeared. My mother's reaction was chilling. She informed me he'd left both of us, as though we were two items on a curb. She didn't cry or seem sad, she just gave me this look of condescending triumph, like she'd won. After that, life became a dreary series of routines. I cooked for myself unless she decided to make something she knew I despised. I washed my own clothes, walked to school alone, and came home to find her either out on dates or silently watching TV. If I asked for money to buy school supplies, she acted as though I were draining her life savings. She'd make me wait days before grudgingly handing me a few bills, telling me to be grateful she bothered at all. I remember when I was 11, my class was going on a field trip, and the cost was minimal. She refused to pay. When I pleaded with her, explaining that all my friends would be going, she sniffed and said, "Sounds like you need new friends." That's when I realized she took a twisted pleasure in denying me normal childhood experiences. I tried to convince myself that it was some misguided attempt to teach me independence, but I gradually saw the truth. She didn't want me around, period. When I was 14, she started dating Alan, a man with a 12-year-old son named Tyler. At first, I didn't mind. Alan was nice enough. He asked me generic questions about school, actually listened for 10 seconds, then drifted back to whatever he and my mother were discussing. Tyler was polite at first, a little shy. I thought maybe we could get along. But then, my mother turned every interaction into a show of how wonderful Tyler was. I'd walk into the living room and see them giggling over some video. The second she noticed me, her face would stiffen. She'd send me to fetch something or tell me to tidy up. Tyler rarely made eye contact with me after that. Over time, it became obvious that she was lavishing all the affection she'd denied me onto Tyler. She took him shopping for sports gear, bragged about his soccer skills to every neighbor, and posted dozens of photos of them grinning side by side. I was not in a single photo. Even Alan seemed slightly uncomfortable, but he never said anything to discourage her. When Tyler moved in, I found my posters in the trash. My mother said, "They're childish," then replaced them with Tyler's trophies and his team pictures. She painted his room in bright colors, calling it our new family project. Meanwhile, my room remained the same drab space I'd always had, except now it often served as storage for boxes of Tyler's off-season gear. I tried to keep the peace. If I didn't speak much, I reasoned, she'd have no ammunition. I focused on my schoolwork, hoping my grades would get me a scholarship somewhere far away. My mother seemed happy to ignore me, except to demand chores or wave off any question I had about dinner. I ate whatever scraps I could find if she bothered to cook, usually the meals Tyler disliked. One evening, I noticed something off about my plate of spaghetti. A strange, bitter aftertaste lingered in my mouth and my stomach cramped a few hours later. My mother stood by the sink, watching me with a smug smile. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Maybe the sauce had gone bad. But I couldn't forget that look on her face. It was too satisfied. Over the next few weeks, I caught her smirking whenever I ate something she prepared. Often, I'd feel queasy later, but never enough to go to the hospital. Suspicion gnawed at me. Could she really be tampering with my food? I decided to set up a small camera. It was cheap, not the best quality, but I hid it on top of a cabinet in the kitchen, angled just right to capture the counter where she usually prepped meals. I labeled my leftovers and told her I planned to eat them the next day, making sure they were in a distinct container. Then I went to hang out at a friend's place for a few hours. Later that night, with my heart hammering, I checked the footage. She walked into the kitchen, glanced around, and took my container out of the fridge. She opened it, rummaged under the sink, then sprinkled something into my food. The camera wasn't high definition, but it clearly showed her holding a little container of powdered cleaner we kept for scrubbing the stove. She stirred it into my leftovers. Then, unbelievably, she put the container back, sealed it, and gave a little sneer as she closed the fridge. My blood ran cold. All these years of her passive-aggressive digs and cold demeanor were nothing compared to this. She was literally poisoning me. The next day, I faked eating those leftovers and tossed them out in a public bin far from home. For a while, I felt numb, not sure what to do. Going to the police immediately sounded logical, but I was still a minor, and I'd heard horror stories about the foster care system. Plus, I worried nobody would believe me, or she'd claim I fabricated the footage. So I resolved to gather more evidence. I bought a few small cameras online, stashed them around the kitchen and living room, and even started recording audio of her snide remarks. My mother continued her campaign, tampering with any food she thought I'd eat. She sometimes made sly comments to Tyler, who would giggle but never confront her. Alan seemed blissfully ignorant, though I suspected he was just relieved she wasn't making his life difficult. When I turned 16, my mother's hostility escalated. She openly criticized me in front of Alan, calling me a dead weight who contributed nothing. He'd sometimes glance at me apologetically, but he never defended me. She started restricting what groceries I could access, labeling things as Tyler's so I wouldn't dare touch them. I got a part-time job walking dogs and babysitting just to buy my own necessities. With every small pay I received, I put a little aside. I wanted a safety net for the day I could finally leave. That safety net grew slowly, but so did my collection of evidence. I caught her sprinkling powders, liquids, even small crushed pills into my meals. Fortunately, I'd gotten good at pretending to eat. I'd either flush it down the toilet or quietly discard it outside. I documented everything, saving the footage on multiple USB drives and an online backup. It was horrifying to rewatch these clips, seeing my mother's face twist with satisfaction as she attempted to harm me. But it hardened my resolve. I would not confront her prematurely. I had to wait until I was sure she couldn't weasel out of punishment. Meanwhile, she basked in playing doting mother to Tyler, bringing him new clothes and gadgets, celebrating every trivial milestone in his life. He reveled in her attention, shooting me smug looks whenever she praised him for something simple. Their little alliance sickened me, but I kept my head down. I sometimes fantasized about revenge, about watching her pay for the horrible things she'd done. Yet, I also had to be practical. If I left before graduation, I'd jeopardize my schooling and any chance of scholarships. When I was 17, I secretly met with a teacher I trusted. I showed her a short clip of my mother tampering with my food. The teacher was horrified and helped me contact a lawyer who specialized in minors dealing with abuse. He advised that, while I could go to the authorities now, my mother might spin it as a rebellious teen forging videos. We decided to keep collecting irrefutable evidence. My 18th birthday was less than a year away. If I could hold out until then, I'd have more legal standing to press charges as an adult, and she wouldn't be able to manipulate me further. During that final year, my mother's bitterness intensified. Alan still remained mostly on the sidelines, but he occasionally complained that things felt tense. She'd wave him off or blame me, saying I was difficult to handle. Tyler was enjoying his teenage years, oblivious or indifferent to my suffering. Sometimes, I'd see him rummaging in my room without permission, likely trying to find anything he could use against me or amuse himself by violating my privacy. I started locking my door when I wasn't home, but my mother would override my lock if she felt like it. I continued to gather recordings, both video and audio. I documented verbal tirades where she called me worthless and implied that I should just leave if you hate it here so much. Once, I overheard her telling Tyler she wished she'd never had a daughter, that her life would have been easier. Tyler laughed, and I realized he'd become her co-conspirator, happy to watch me suffer as long as it kept him in her good graces. Finally, the day I graduated high school arrived. My mother and Tyler didn't come to the ceremony. Alan showed up briefly but left right after I got my diploma. I wasn't disappointed. Their absence only confirmed what I'd known all along. Instead, I focused on my plan. I had a small storage unit where I'd been moving my belongings a bit at a time. That evening, I packed up the last of my essential items, including my hidden cameras and USB drives. My mother ambled into the living room, suspicious but not alarmed. She probably assumed I was bluffing whenever I talked about leaving. I told her plainly, "I'm moving out." She wore a mocking half-smile as if to say, "Good riddance." Tyler hung back, arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen. That's when I brought up the videos. Her expression faltered for a moment, then she scoffed, claiming I was making things up. I pulled out my phone and showed her a single clip of her sprinkling powder into my food. Her face went white. Tyler's eyes bulged. Alan, who just walked in, demanded to know what was going on. I calmly explained I had months of footage of her attempting to poison me, plus diaries she'd written long ago stating how she regretted ever having a daughter. She lunged at me, shrieking that I was a liar. Alan had to hold her back. Tyler shouted something about how I was ruining everything. I informed them all that I'd already backed up the videos and sent copies to my lawyer. If she tried to contact me again, or if Tyler tried any intimidation, I'd go straight to the police. Then I walked out the door, leaving them in stunned silence. I moved into a tiny, rundown apartment, but it was mine. I got a second part-time job, scraping by on cheap groceries and hardly any furniture. It didn't matter. I could breathe. I wasn't constantly checking my food for poison. I started therapy, trying to unpack the years of psychological damage. My therapist was the one who really encouraged me not to wait any longer to press charges. She said, "This isn't just about you. What if she does this to someone else?" On my 18th birthday, I walked into a police station with my lawyer. We handed over everything: the camera footage, the diaries, screenshots of her texts threatening me after I left. The police seemed shocked but took it seriously. Child endangerment, attempted poisoning, assault. They rattled off potential charges. My mother was taken in for questioning. She claimed I'd doctored the videos. Then they showed her the diaries and made her listen to the audio recordings of her laughing about tainting my food. She couldn't worm her way out of that. Tyler was questioned too. He was flustered, contradicting himself, trying to shield his mother. Alan claimed ignorance, which might have been partially true, but the investigators weren't thrilled with how little he'd noticed. The case moved forward quickly, given how explicit the evidence was. My mother made bail thanks to Alan, but when the preliminary hearing came, the prosecution presented enough to ensure this was heading to trial. My mother's lawyer tried the angle that she wasn't in her right mind, that it was a stress-induced breakdown. The prosecutor dismantled that excuse by pointing out the repeated, methodical nature of her actions supported by camera footage. She wasn't lashing out once or twice. She was doing this regularly, with planning and intent. Tyler wasn't charged with anything criminal, but his role as an onlooker who sometimes egged her on was noted. Alan tried to plead with me, saying Tyler's future would be ruined if I kept going. I told him that Tyler's future was not my concern after he stood by and watched his mother poison me. Alan didn't have a reply to that. At the trial, I sat on the witness stand, describing the fear I lived with. I explained how she'd poisoned my meals, how I had the presence of mind to avoid ingesting too much once I caught on. The prosecution showed clip after clip, each worse than the last. My mother giggling, making nasty remarks about how I might lose weight or learn a lesson. The defense tried to argue lack of harmful intent, but that crumbled under the sheer volume of evidence. Lab tests on the substances confirmed they were harmful chemicals, entirely unfit for consumption. In one instance, the powder could cause serious internal damage if taken in large quantities. When the guilty verdict came, I felt something break inside me, a final release. The judge pronounced her guilty on multiple counts, including child endangerment and attempted assault. She was sentenced to several years in prison. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was enough to ensure she'd carry that label forever. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I ever had, with no intention of offering her any mercy or forgiveness. She'd tried to rid herself of me, and she failed. Now she was the one banished from normal life. Alan didn't speak to me after the trial. I heard through old neighbors that he divorced her and moved away with Tyler. Maybe they couldn't stand the shame, or maybe he finally realized the kind of person he'd been living with. Either way, I didn't care. My mother's new perfect family was in ruins. She'd orchestrated her own downfall by pushing me too far, forgetting that I had more resilience and intelligence than she ever gave me credit for. The diaries that once spelled out her hatred for me became key pieces of evidence, sealing her fate. Some people who hear my story ask if I ever consider reconciliation. They assume I might soften over time, especially since she's my mother. But I refuse. She tried to poison me, laughed as I ate tainted food. There's no forgiveness in my heart for someone who intentionally harmed me and took pleasure in it. My revenge was thorough and final, seeing her in handcuffs, forced to face the truth in a courtroom, and then thrown behind bars. I owe her nothing. I won't visit her in prison. I won't write letters. As far as I'm concerned, she ceased to exist in my life the day the judge delivered the verdict. I've moved on. I'm in college now, thanks to scholarships I worked hard to earn. It's a tough balancing act with finances, but I take pride in my independence. No one can dictate what I eat or what I wear. I have a small circle of friends who know bits of my past. They're supportive and never push me to talk about it more than I want to. Therapy has been my safe space to dissect the trauma, but my main focus is building a future that's entirely mine. I dream of having a career that gives me stability, maybe even starting a family on my own terms one day, if I decide I want one. Sometimes I still have nightmares about her standing over my shoulder, whispering that I'm worthless. But then I wake up and remember that she's locked away, that the system she tried so hard to manipulate turned against her once the evidence came to light. Those nightmares grow less frequent with time. Instead of her voice, I hear my own, reminding me of what I overcame. In moments of reflection, I think back to the first time I realized something was deeply wrong with our relationship. I was 6, holding up a picture I'd drawn, hoping for just a smile. She gave me the most forced, tight-lipped grin and said, "Why are the arms so long?" That tiny moment crystallized years later into the certainty that she would never love me. I've accepted that fact. She picked the wrong person to underestimate. She might have destroyed me if she'd been a bit subtler or if I'd been more naive, but I was done letting her walk all over me the second I tasted that bitter tang in my food and saw her smirk. People often say the best revenge is living well. In my case, the best revenge was also ensuring she faced real consequences. I don't regret a single step I took to collect and preserve evidence. I don't regret pressing charges. If I could rewind time, I'd do it all again. Let her rot. She never wanted me in her life, and now she gets to live without me, in a cell where she can't hurt anyone else. I've blocked any attempts at contact from her. She sent me letters at first, alternating between furious threats and hollow pleas. I handed them directly to my lawyer, adding them to the growing stack of evidence. She tried calling, and I changed my number. When she's eventually released, I hope she understands there's nothing left between us. I've carved out my own identity, separate from her twisted world. My father never stepped in to rescue me, and she used that abandonment as a weapon for years. It's ironic that she ended up abandoned herself by Alan and Tyler, by neighbors who once admired her superficial charm, and most importantly, by the daughter she despised. I might never fully heal from what happened, but each day I distance myself further from the person she tried to break. I'm proud of who I'm becoming, someone who refused to be silent in the face of evil. She taught me one lesson inadvertently, to never let anyone dictate my worth. If there's any shred of gratitude I might have, it's that I learned early on how to survive. So, that's the story. My mother loathed having a daughter so much that she tried to push me out of her precious new family and even tampered with my food to accomplish it. She smirked as I swallowed who knows what. But in the end, I got the last laugh. She sits in prison, stripped of her maternal facade, and I'm here, rebuilding my life. There's no forgiveness. I'm not interested in cathartic closure with hugs and tears. Revenge was the only fitting resolution, and trust me, it was extremely satisfying to watch her face justice. If she ever wonders why I didn't just disappear quietly, maybe she'll recall that day in the courtroom when I stood up and told the whole truth. That's the day she lost everything she pretended to hold dear. I'm sharing my story because people sometimes assume mother knows best. In my case, my mother knew exactly what she was doing, and it was malicious to the core. If anyone reading this is going through something similar, know that you're not crazy for suspecting foul play. Document everything. Tell someone you trust. You don't have to forgive atrocities committed against you, especially by someone who's supposed to protect you. Sometimes, the only closure is to see justice served. I live free now, free from her smirks, her sabotage, her relentless disdain. I don't worry about whether she approves of my clothes or scoffs at my dreams. I don't flinch at every creak in the house, wondering if she's lurking. And I don't have to eat anything with hidden poison. That alone is worth every moment I spent planning her downfall, because that's exactly what I did. I took all her hatred, gathered proof of it, and turned it into the weapon that sent her to prison. I guess a part of me wishes things had been different. If she'd loved me, if my father had stayed, if we could have been a normal family. But wishing changes nothing. Action did. My final act was refusing to let her get away with attempted murder. I hope that's a clear enough message. She wrote me off as a burden, tried to dispose of me, and failed. I walked out stronger than ever. So, while I'll never have the kind of childhood some people take for granted, I've built a future that's entirely mine. That's the greatest revenge I could possibly ask for. I found out my parents betrayed me when a bank I didn't recognize called me, insisting I needed to verify details about a large loan. At first, I assumed it was a scam, but something felt off, so I pulled my credit report and nearly fainted at the sight of a $150,000 loan under my name. I'd never applied for anything even close to that. Once I calmed my racing heart, I called the bank back and asked for documentation. They emailed me the signed forms, which showed a sloppy version of my signature alongside my parents' names as co-signers. My address was listed as theirs, not mine. Everything pointed to one conclusion. My mother and father had forged my signature and taken out a huge loan, presumably without thinking twice about how it might affect me. Worse still, I quickly learned this loan was used to pay for my sister's extravagant wedding. I hadn't even been invited to that wedding. Cecilia, my older sister, always seemed to be the favored child, but I never dreamed my parents would prioritize her so completely that they'd commit fraud in my name. When I confronted them, they offered no real apology. My dad insisted it was just a temporary fix until Cecilia's new husband supposedly paid them back. My mom cried and claimed they did it out of desperation for her special day. I asked why nobody bothered to ask me first, and my mother mumbled something about how I'd never agree anyway. They assumed I'd be difficult, so they went behind my back. That alone stung, but the deeper wound was realizing my parents had no respect for my future or my rights. My own sister, who cut me off years ago over some minor disagreement, apparently had zero remorse about using stolen money to fund her dream wedding. I decided I wouldn't let them walk all over me anymore. I sought legal advice, determined to prove that this forgery wasn't my doing. My lawyer told me I had a case for identity theft and the bank might eventually remove my name from the loan if I pursued charges. It wouldn't be easy. Filing a police report against my own parents felt daunting, but I refused to let them destroy my credit and leave me drowning in debt. They betrayed me on a massive scale, and I wanted them to understand the consequences. At first, I thought maybe they'd fix it quickly if I threatened legal action, but they were strangely confident that I would back down. They played the family card, said I should be grateful they raised me, and insisted it would all be paid off soon. I knew better. My sister's husband was notorious for shady business deals, and he had a history of making promises he never kept. I braced myself for battle, unwilling to let this slide. Nobody else would look out for me. Certainly not my parents, who had abandoned everything. I reached out to a friend who worked in finance, hoping for a clearer perspective. He confirmed that if my signature was forged, I could dispute the loan and potentially force the bank to remove it from my credit. But he warned it might become a lengthy battle. My parents, meanwhile, tried to gaslight me into believing it wasn't a big deal. They swore they'd handle the monthly payments. I told them I wasn't about to trust their empty promises. My father grew hostile, accusing me of sabotaging family unity. My mother just wept and said I should understand how important my sister's wedding was. That made my blood boil. Was it so important that my own financial security didn't matter? They had no answers for that. I hung up every call feeling more betrayed. I decided to file a formal identity theft report. The bank took it seriously once I provided documentation of my actual signature, plus proof I hadn't been living at my parents' address. They launched an investigation and placed the loan on hold. Meanwhile, I contacted the credit bureaus to dispute the account, making sure nobody tried to collect from me. I expected my parents to panic and apologize. Instead, they seemed outraged that I was dragging our family's dirty laundry into the public eye. My sister texted me for the first time in years, demanding I drop everything. She claimed her husband's business deals would pay off soon and that I was being petty. She didn't even bother to ask how I was doing, just focused on her own crisis. I replied that if she truly had access to so much money, she could take the loan off my hands immediately. Her response was silence. I knew she was bluffing, just as my parents were. Nobody in this family was willing to accept responsibility for the fraud they'd committed. My lawyer recommended sending a cease and desist letter, demanding that my parents stop contacting me unless it was through legal counsel. He told me to document every phone call, text, or email for future reference. I felt a heaviness in my chest at the thought of waging legal war against my own mom and dad, but they crossed a line that no parent should cross. Every time I doubted myself, I remembered that I was not even invited to the wedding my stolen signature financed. That slight was the final spark that fueled my anger. If they could lie, cheat, and treat me like an obstacle, I had every right to defend myself. Blood might be thicker than water, but my parents made it clear where I stood. Even after everything, they expected unconditional loyalty. That was impossible now. I began building my case, collecting digital proof, emails, and the loan application logs. My parents were about to learn that betraying me had real consequences. I wasn't searching for a reconciliation. I wanted justice, and I wanted them to face the fallout they alone created. The police report was the next big step. I went to the station, heart pounding, and explained everything to an officer. Filing a complaint against my own parents felt surreal, yet I knew it had to be done. The officer listened, took notes, and asked if I had any proof tying them directly to the forgery. I handed over the documents from the bank, along with screenshots of text messages where my parents admitted they took out the loan for Cecilia. The officer said it was enough to open an investigation. I walked out of there both terrified and relieved. My phone blew up a few days later when my parents realized I had gone to the police. Dad called me screaming, accusing me of destroying our family. Mom begged me to drop it, blaming Cecilia's naive dreams and saying they only wanted her to be happy. I told them I was done listening. If they wanted to fix this, they could come clean to the bank and find a legitimate way to remove my name. Otherwise, I wasn't going to budge. The silence that followed was deafening. Cecilia tried to text me again, accusing me of craving attention. She claimed her husband was close to finalizing a massive contract that would cover everything. I asked why they hadn't covered it already. She had no answer. Eventually, I blocked her. At this point, the bank's investigation escalated. They told me they had enough evidence to reclassify the loan as fraudulent once the police confirmed the charges. My lawyer warned me that my parents might face criminal consequences. I just nodded, numb. They did this to themselves. Days later, I heard that detectives visited my parents' house. My mother called in hysterics, insisting she'd never meant to hurt me. But I saw through it all. She was scared because someone was finally holding them accountable. I remained calm and told her that this was the direct result of their choices. For once, she had nothing to say. My father sent me one final message, insisting I was cruel to do this and that I'd regret turning on my own blood. I stared at those words, remembering all the times I came second to Cecilia. This was the final straw. If that made me cruel, so be it. They forced my hand the moment they decided my identity was theirs to exploit. My attorney kept me updated on the legal process. Charges wouldn't be immediate, but the evidence was stacking up. I focused on my job and tried to keep myself sane as the storm raged around me. My sister's lavish wedding photos hit social media, and all I could think was how those flowers, that gown, those centerpieces were basically stolen off my back. I waited for the day my parents would truly understand the cost of lying to me. By now, I'd lost any hint of sympathy. They burned that bridge the minute they signed my name illegally. Eventually, the district attorney got involved. My lawyer told me the case was strong because of clear evidence of forgery and the digital paper trail linking the application to my parents' IP address. They were indicted on charges of fraud and identity theft. I remember reading that email and feeling an odd mix of triumph and despair. I never wanted to see my parents facing possible jail time, but I also knew this was the only way they'd learn. Once news spread, relatives started calling me to plead for leniency. They said my parents were good people who made a mistake. I refused to hear it. For years, I'd played second fiddle to Cecilia. This time, I was standing up for myself. My sister posted a tirade online, accusing me of tearing our family apart over a small loan. She conveniently left out that I wasn't invited to her wedding and that the loan was $150,000. When people asked her why she didn't just repay it, she vanished from the comments. I watched this unfold in a sort of numb detachment. My energy was focused on making sure the bank cleared my name and my credit remained intact. Slowly, the bank moved toward removing me from the loan. They saw enough proof to believe I'd been a victim of fraud. Meanwhile, my parents were saddled with the debt since they were listed as co-signers. That meant even if they avoided jail, they still owed a fortune. Word got around that they tried to refinance their home and failed, their credit tanking under the weight of this new liability. Friends who felt sorry for them told me I should reconsider pressing charges. They even said a felony conviction would ruin my parents' lives. I thought about how they'd almost ruined mine. Then I decided I owed them nothing. If they needed to beg the court for mercy, that was on them. The court hearings began. My parents showed up looking frail and exhausted. My mother tried to make eye contact with me. I refused to acknowledge her. My dad stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Their attorney requested a plea deal. My lawyer told me it was likely they'd plead guilty if they could avoid the worst penalties. I wasn't out for blood. I simply wanted my name cleared and for them to shoulder the financial burden. The judge set another date to finalize everything. In the meantime, my sister's life began falling apart. Her husband bailed when creditors started calling, leaving her stuck with wedding bills and a scandalized reputation. I felt no sympathy. She'd reaped exactly what she sowed. My parents had set all this in motion by forging my signature without a second thought. Now we waited for a legal resolution. Revenge, in my eyes, was watching them squirm under a burden they'd created. I had no interest in mending fences. This was about protecting myself from any further harm. I refused. The final hearing arrived, and the tension was palpable. My parents looked defeated. They each pled guilty to reduced charges, striking a deal that included restitution and probation instead of jail time. I sat there, stone-faced, listening to them admit they'd forged my name and taken out a loan without my consent. The judge asked if I wished to speak. I stood up, hand trembling, and explained how their actions had jeopardized my financial future, violated my trust, and made it impossible to see them as loving parents anymore. I requested strict enforcement of restitution so I wouldn't be saddled with any lingering debt. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. My parents avoided my eyes. I felt a wave of closure wash over me. They couldn't hide or brush this aside now. Their lawyer assured the court they would pay every cent back. Outside, reporters weren't present, but some distant relatives stood by whispering. I walked away alone, ignoring my parents' attempts to approach me. My mother's sobs echoed in the hallway, but I kept going. I had nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, I finalized all the paperwork clearing me of responsibility for the loan. My credit score recovered, though it took time. I heard my parents eventually sold their house to manage the debt. Cecilia's marriage didn't last. Her husband fled once his phony deals fell apart. She called me one day, tearful and desperate, claiming she had no one else to turn to. I let it go to voicemail. She had shown me no compassion when I was fighting for my financial life. Why should I help her now? I blocked her number. My parents also tried reaching out, sending letters that shifted between guilt trips and apologies. It was too late. They'd crossed a boundary I couldn't forgive, so I ignored them too. I found a new sense of peace in the quiet that followed. Nobody was hounding me for money. The loan was fully out of my name. My apartment felt more like home, a place free from deceit. Some nights I lay awake remembering the good times with my parents, wondering if I should feel regret. But they made their choice, and so did I. I wasn't going to pretend everything was fine just to spare them consequences. They'd shown me exactly how little my well-being mattered to them. So I closed that door for good. Revenge, for me, was seeing them stripped of the comfortable complacency they'd once had. It felt like justice, and I had no shame about that. People say forgive and forget, but some betrayals run too deep. Mine sure did. What they did was unforgivable, and I never once considered giving them a pass. If they hoped time would heal this wound, they were mistaken. I shut them out and focused on rebuilding my life. Without their toxic presence, I felt stronger, clearer, and more determined to protect myself. They still existed in my past. Every so often, I hear snippets of their new reality. My parents live in a cramped rental now, barely making ends meet. Cecilia moved back to town, crashed on their couch, and whines about her failed marriage. None of them speak to me directly, but I know they blame me for exposing their crime. Some relatives shake their heads and say I took it too far. I don't care. They weren't the ones whose signature was forged for an astronomical wedding. They weren't the ones left with a crushing debt and no remorseful apology. My conscience is clear. I protected myself, and I would do it again. Friends sometimes ask if I miss having a family. I tell them I do mourn the loss of what could have been, but not the reality of what we actually had. My family dynamic was already skewed. This betrayal merely forced everything into the open. I have a new circle of people I trust, friends who genuinely care about me without demanding blind loyalty. I have peace of mind, knowing nobody is sneaking around behind my back, forging my name. That alone is worth any price. Sometimes I think of the day I discovered the forged loan. The shock, the fear, the heartbreak, it feels distant now, like a bad dream I finally woke from. Taking legal action was the turning point. Had I caved to guilt or pity, I'd still be stuck under that debt, powerless and angry. Instead, I chose to fight back. The satisfaction I feel isn't just about revenge, it's about reclaiming my agency. Nobody else can decide my worth or my destiny. My parents tried, and they failed. If they ever hoped for forgiveness, they won't find it here. My refusal to forgive is my boundary, my shield against further harm. They already proved they'd choose Cecilia over me at any cost, even if it meant risking my financial ruin. I learned not to let that happen again. Cutting them off was painful at first, but now it feels necessary. I am living proof that standing up for yourself can come with harsh consequences. You might lose people you once loved, but you keep your dignity intact. My parents gambled on me just rolling over, quietly paying off a wedding I never attended. They never saw the steel in my spine until it was too late. Now they're paying for their actions, and I don't lose sleep over it. That is the real conclusion to this story. My parents tried to steal my future, but they only succeeded in losing me forever. My sister remains bitter, surrounded by the wreckage of her fantasy wedding. She learned too late that illusions of grandeur come with a price. As for me, I'm finally free. If anyone dares ask if I'd ever forgive, my answer is simple. Never. They can keep their apologies and excuses. I owe them nothing. This was my breaking point. They do not deserve it. My dad remarried when I was 17, after my mom passed away a few years earlier. I never fully embraced my stepmom, but I tried to get along because I wanted my dad to be happy. During that time, I met my new stepsister, Nadine, who was a few years younger than me. She was quiet and we never really formed a sisterly bond, but we respected each other's space. My dad had always treated me like an adult, especially after Mom died, so I assumed he'd also treat me fairly when it came to finances and big life decisions. Right after I turned 21, I received a small inheritance from my maternal grandparents. It wasn't massive, but it was a decent sum, enough that I felt secure about my future. My dad knew about this money. We talked about it, and he always said I should save it for something important, maybe a down payment on a house or furthering my own education. I took him at his word, but then, a year later, Nadine graduated high school and decided she wanted to attend a private college. My dad came to me with a plan. If I loaned him the money to cover Nadine's tuition, he'd repay me within 5 years. He said he and my stepmom didn't have the funds right then, but as soon as their finances stabilized, they'd return every cent. He reassured me that this was a guaranteed arrangement I wouldn't regret. I was hesitant, but I'd always been raised to trust my dad. He told me how important it was for Nadine to get the right education, and I felt guilty if I didn't help. He also dangled the idea that he'd pay me back with interest as a gesture of gratitude. Looking back, I should have demanded a formal contract, but we settled for some scribbled notes on a piece of paper. My dad said family didn't need more than that. I believed him, so I wrote a check and handed over a significant chunk of my inheritance. In the back of my mind, I figured I'd have it back long before I needed it. My dad seemed grateful, and Nadine was thankful in her timid way. She and I hardly spoke about it. I assumed everything would work out in the end. Time passed quickly. I moved out, got my own place, and found a steady job. Nadine stayed in her dorm, rarely came home, and I rarely heard updates about her college life. Occasionally, my dad would mention that things were tight financially, but he never forgot his promise. At first, I was patient. I wasn't in a rush to buy a house, so I figured I could wait until the 5-year mark he'd set. For a while, I trusted that he would make good on his word because he was still my dad, and I believed in him. But as the years rolled on, I noticed he never once brought up how he planned to gather the repayment. Instead, he'd go on about how proud he was of Nadine's accomplishments and how her future looked bright. Whenever I hinted that I'd appreciate some kind of repayment schedule, he'd brush it off and say he needed just a bit more time. "Don't worry," he'd say, "I won't let you down." I wanted to believe him, so I kept quiet. Then I met Jason, who would eventually become my fiancé. We clicked immediately, shared values, and had plans for our future together. He wasn't from the same social circles as my dad and stepmom, but he treated me better than anyone I'd dated before. He was real and honest and worked hard for what he had. When we got engaged 2 years ago, I started thinking seriously about using my inheritance, once it was repaid, for the wedding expenses and possibly a house down payment. By that point, about 6 years had passed since I'd written that check for Nadine's tuition. My dad had never paid me back a single dollar. My patience was wearing thin. I approached him gently at first, explaining that it was time for him to start repaying me because Jason and I needed money for our wedding budget. My dad just stared at me with a heavy expression, like I'd asked for something unreasonable. He said, "I'm sorry, but I can't support that wedding. I don't approve of you marrying someone who doesn't respect our family's values. If you're going to go through with it, don't expect me to bankroll it." I reminded him that this wasn't about him paying for the wedding. This was about him returning the money I'd loaned him years ago, the money that was rightfully mine. He waved me off, said, "You should have known better than to give me that money if you needed it for something so trivial." I was stunned. Trivial? My own wedding was trivial? He wouldn't meet my eyes, and I felt my heart drop to the floor. This was the first time I realized my dad might never give me back a cent. It wasn't just about disapproving of Jason, it was about control. He liked that I relied on him emotionally, and he wasn't above using my own money as leverage. I was angry, but I still held onto a glimmer of hope. Maybe if I talked to him rationally and explained how much I needed this money, he'd come around. I tried again, sending emails outlining how we could set up a payment plan. I even offered to extend the time frame or reduce any interest he might have owed me. He never responded. My stepmom acted like it wasn't her business, even though I knew she had benefited from my loan too. Nadine graduated and went on to grad school, presumably on scholarships or loans. Nobody ever shared the details. She barely spoke to me unless it was a polite greeting at a holiday gathering. It was clear that everyone in that house had moved on, and my dad had no intention of revisiting his promise. I felt like a fool for trusting him in the first place. He was my father, and he betrayed me. I reached a breaking point when Jason and I started booking venues and making deposits for our wedding. We had a modest budget, but we were determined to pay for most of it ourselves. However, the money I'd lost to my dad would have been a huge help. My frustration boiled over one night, and I told Jason everything about the loan, the broken promises, and my dad's refusal to repay me. Jason was furious on my behalf, but he also supported my decision to pursue legal avenues if necessary. I decided to collect any evidence I had, old emails, the scribbled note my dad signed, and anything that might prove that money was a loan, not a gift. I asked a lawyer friend for advice, and he said I had a decent case for small claims court. I wrestled with the idea. Suing my own dad felt extreme, but he'd left me no choice. He was acting like my money was just his to keep. At that point, my resentment overshadowed any guilt I might have felt. If he was going to be stubborn, then I'd fight back. Jason stood by me, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about justice, about not letting him walk all over me simply because he was my father. Before filing anything, I decided to confront him one last time. I showed up at his house unannounced. My stepmom was out, and Nadine was away. It was just the two of us. I laid out all the documents, explained that I was serious, and I needed the money back. I might have gotten emotional. I remember my voice shaking as I told him how hurt I was, how this wasn't fair, how he'd promised me something that I desperately needed now. He stayed quiet for a while, then he looked me in the eyes and said, "You've changed. You're letting that man manipulate you. This isn't who I raised you to be." I lost it. I yelled, told him how dare he accuse Jason of manipulation when he was the one who took advantage of his own daughter. I demanded he repay me within 30 days, or I'd see him in court. He scoffed, told me I wouldn't dare, and said I was ungrateful for everything he'd done. In that moment, I felt all the illusions of fatherly love shatter. He wasn't going to budge. As I walked out of that house, I realized I was finally severing the emotional ties that had kept me from fighting back. He'd taken my trust for granted one too many times. I filed the claim in small claims court. My lawyer friend helped me draft the paperwork. I had the original note, which clearly stated that the money was a loan for Nadine's tuition and that my dad would pay me back by a certain date. The date had passed over a year ago. I also had bank statements showing the withdrawal from my account and the deposit into his. The entire process felt surreal. Part of me kept expecting him to call and say, "We can work something out," but he never did. Instead, he avoided me entirely. My stepmom sent me a single text, "You're tearing this family apart." I didn't respond. Nadine didn't contact me at all. It took a couple of months for the court date to arrive. During that time, my wedding planning continued. Jason and I opted for something smaller to cut costs. My dad certainly wasn't contributing, so we had to be extra mindful of our budget. I tried not to let the legal drama overshadow the joy of planning my wedding, but every time I sat down to finalize the guest list, I felt a pang in my chest. I didn't want him there, not anymore. He'd made it clear that he didn't respect my fiancé or my choices. There was no way I was going to keep a seat open for someone who actively withheld my money and called my marriage trivial. That's when I removed him from the invitations altogether. It felt like a painful but necessary step. The day in court was nerve-wracking. My dad arrived looking sullen and irritated. He had a lawyer with him, someone I recognized as a local acquaintance of his, probably working at a reduced rate. I had my friend who guided me through the proceedings. The judge listened patiently as I explained the situation, handed over evidence, and detailed how the agreement came about. My dad's lawyer tried to claim that the money was a gift, but our scribbled note proved otherwise. His lawyer also tried to argue that the statute of limitations might apply, but we'd made the agreement less than 10 years ago, and I had continuous emails reminding him of the debt. The judge seemed unimpressed with my dad's excuses. When it was his turn to speak, he rambled on about how I was marrying someone he didn't approve of and that he shouldn't be forced to pay for something that went against his beliefs. The judge cut him off, reminding him that the case was about a loan, not about whether or not he liked my fiancée. In the end, I won. The court ordered my dad to pay me back the principal amount plus a small amount of interest. He was given a strict deadline. I remember feeling a surge of relief. Justice was served, but the heartbreak of knowing my dad would stoop so low was still there. Regardless, I was satisfied. He wouldn't get away with it. I thought that would be the end, but my dad decided to make it ugly. He refused to pay by the court-ordered date. When I tried to enforce the judgment, he made it a point to transfer all his assets under my stepmom's name, which complicated everything. I got letters from his lawyer claiming that he had no liquid funds, no property in his name, and no way to pay me. It was a blatant attempt to dodge the ruling. My lawyer friend explained that there were ways to challenge this, but it would take time and money. I was caught between wanting to move forward with my life and wanting to hold my dad accountable. The idea that he'd go to such lengths to avoid paying me back was infuriating. That's when I decided to take a different route. I knew how important his reputation was to him. He ran a small local business, prided himself on being a pillar of the community, and he'd always bragged about his integrity. I gathered every piece of evidence I had, our loan agreement, the court ruling, the communications from his lawyer, and wrote a factual account of how he was refusing to pay a debt to his own daughter. I posted it online in local community groups with copies of the judgment attached. I didn't embellish or slander him, I just laid out the truth in plain text. If he wanted to hide behind legal loopholes, I would make sure everyone knew. The fallout was immediate. Clients started questioning his ethics. His business partners didn't like the negative publicity. He tried to contact me in a fury, leaving voicemails that alternated between threats and pleas. He said I was sabotaging his livelihood. I refused to pick up his calls. He'd already made it clear that he had no respect for me. Now he wanted me to take down the truth to protect his precious image. I stood my ground. I told him that once he paid me what the court said he owed, I'd gladly post an update saying the matter was resolved. Until then, the information would remain up. My stepmom showed up at my apartment crying, saying I was ruining their lives. I told her that I'd given them every chance to repay me, and they chose to ignore the ruling. If they wanted to keep everything quiet, they should have paid their debts. She stormed off, muttering curses. In the end, my dad buckled. He found a way to free up the funds, and the money appeared in my bank account shortly before my wedding. There was no apology attached. He didn't show up at the ceremony, he wasn't welcome, and even if he had been, I doubt he would have come. My stepmom and Nadine didn't attend either. Jason and I had a beautiful wedding regardless. We were surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us. I used part of the money to cover some last-minute wedding bills, and we put the rest into a savings account for our future. I wish I could say that I forgave my dad, but I haven't. I can't. He betrayed me, tried to manipulate me, and attempted to evade a legal judgment. He forced me to drag everything into the public sphere just to get what was rightfully mine. I'm moving on, but I'll never forget or forgive. Some people say revenge leaves you hollow, but in my case, it gave me closure. He wanted to play dirty, and I gave him a taste of his own medicine. Now, Jason and I are focusing on building a life together without my dad's toxic influence. I have no regrets. If he wanted to stay in my life, he should have honored his promise. That's the story of how my father tried to cheat me and how I made him pay for it, literally.